Chapter 22 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Great Expectations. A whole week passed by before Sylvia had an opportunity of telling her great news to her friend. To begin with, Bridgie was absent from home for 3 days and nights, attending a ball and a water party given by Esmeralda for the entertainment of her house party, and to neither of which Sylvia had received an invitation. To be sure, it was no use going to a dance when dancing was an impossibility, and the getting in and out of boats would have been painful and difficult, but all the same, Sylvia felt slighted and out in the cold, and though absent in the flesh, mentally followed every stage in the two entertainments, and tortured herself by imagining Jack's light-hearted enjoyment and absorption in other company than her own. When Bridgie returned home, Miss Munns insisted on several expeditions to town, and also to surrounding suburbs, where lived those family connections to whom it was clearly the girl's duty to say good-bye. The old lady was quite inclined to enjoy the little stir of preparation involved by the trip abroad, and would allow no one but herself to interview the lady in whose charge her niece was to travel. That she was entirely satisfied was the best possible guarantee for Sylvia's safety, and Mistress Courier Rickman promised to be ready to start the moment the expected wire was received. Miss Munns laid in a store of patent medicines, stocked her niece's work-box with every imaginable useful, and waxed quite affectionate in her manner. But all the same, it was easy to see that she would be relieved to get rid of her charge and settle down once more in the old groove. It requires a great deal of forbearance and unselfish imagination to enable a young person and an old to live together happily, and the lack of these qualities is the explanation of many miserable homes. Old people should remember that the peaceful monotony, which has become their own idea of happiness, must by the laws of nature spell a very different word to buoyant, restless youth, and also that there comes a stage when the children are not children any longer, when they are entitled to their own opinions, and may even, most reverently be it said, understand what is best for themselves better than those of a different generation, and the young people in their turn should remember the long years of tender care and devotion which they have received, and be infinitely patient in their turn. They who are so impatient of passing ailments should try to imagine how it would feel to be always feeble, and to see in the future the certainty of growing more and more suffering and incapable. They should realize that it is in their power to make the sunshine of declining days, and thereby to store up for themselves a lasting joy instead of a reproach. In looking back upon those 2 years spent in Rutland Road, Sylvia forgot her aunt's lack of sympathy, her prosy talk, and repeated fault-finding. They were lost in remembering the true kindness of heart which lay beneath all mannerism. What she was never able to forget was her own impatience and neglect of opportunity. Once or twice, as the days passed by, Bridgie O'Shaughnessy ran to the gate to intercept her friend as she passed, and exchange a hurried greeting, but Sylvia would not trust her great news to such occasions as these. She waited until an opportunity arose for an uninterrupted talk, and as she waited, a desire awoke and grew in intensity to herself tell Jack of the coming separation. Bridgie must, of course, be informed of the journey to France and Germany, but she would wait until the evening of Esmeralda's reception before disclosing the full extent of her travels. When she and Jack were sitting together in one of the charming little niches in which the rooms abounded, he would naturally begin to talk of her journey, and she would smile and look unconcerned, and in the most cheerful and natural of tones announced that she was not coming back to Rutland Road, that it would probably be a year at least before she saw England again. Surely when he heard this for the first time, when it was burst upon him as an utter surprise, she would read in his face whether she had been right in imagining that he really cared, or if it had been a delusion born of girlish vanity. She would be quite calm and serene, would not in any way pose as a martyr or seem to expect any expression of distress, but she could not bring herself to go away without making this one innocent little effort to solve the mystery which meant so much to her happiness and peace of mind. So Sylvia purposely kept out of Bridgie's way during the 10 days after the receipt of her letter, and when they met it was easy to tell just what she chose, and keep silent about the rest, for Bridgie was not one of the curious among womenkind, and never dreamt of questioning and cross-questioning as to the plans of another. She simply took for granted that Sylvia would return to her old quarters after a pleasant summer holiday, just as she was happily assured that her friend felt nothing but purest joy and satisfaction in the prospect before her. "Oh, me darling!" she cried rapturously. "I am delighted for you. Isn't that the very best news that could happen? So soon, too, and a lovely jaunt together in the beautiful summer weather. 'Twill make you strong again in no time, and you will write me long letters telling me all your adventures, and 'twill be almost as good as having them myself. I couldn't tell you when I've been so pleased." "Humph!" said Sylvia disconsolately. Would Jack be delighted also, and hail her departure with rapturous congratulations? "Won't you miss me? Won't you feel lonely when I'm not here?" she questioned earnestly, and Bridgie smiled a cheery reassurement. "I'll have Esmeralda, you see. She will be here until the end of the season, and then we are going up to Scotland with her. We shall be so busy and taken up with one thing and another that I shan't have time to miss you, darling." "Huh!" said Sylvia once more. This was intended for comfort, she was aware, but it was not the kind of comfort that was required. Bridgie O'Shaughnessy might be so unselfish as to rejoice because a friend did not suffer by her absence, but Sylvia longed to hear that she was indispensable, and that nothing and no one could fill her place. It was another bitter drop in her cup to realise that the O'Shaughnessy girls were so closely united that any friend must needs be at a discount in comparison with a sister. "You don't seem as excited as I should have expected. Is there anything worrying you, dear?" Bridgie inquired, and Sylvia hurriedly searched for a plausible excuse and found it in her father's health. In reality she was not disquieted by his reference to his own weakness, for he had been complaining for months back, without apparently growing worse, and she was convinced that the coming rest would speedily restore him to health. It made an excuse, however, and Bridgie sympathised and offered a dozen kindly, unpractical suggestions, as her custom was. Then the conversation drifted to the all-important reception which was so close at hand, and to which both girls were looking forward with such expectation. Bridgie related the latest arrangements for the entertainment of some 300 guests, while her friend listened with eager attention. Esmeralda was sparing neither money nor pains to make the evening one of the events of the season. Singers and musicians whose names were known throughout Europe were to perform at intervals in the great drawing room. The hall and staircase were to be transformed into a bower of roses, pink La France roses, here, there, and everywhere, wreathed around the banisters, massed on the window sills and mantelpieces, hanging in great golden baskets from the ceiling. Rose-coloured shades were to soften the glare of the electric lights. The air was to be kept cool by great blocks of ice, and scented fountains rising from banks of moss and ferns. The conservatory was to be illuminated by jewelled lanterns. It sounded like a fairy tale to the girl in the unfashionable suburb, and she would have been less than human if she had not counted the hours which must elapse before the evening arrived. Bridgie thought it a pity that the guests could not be labelled for the edification of the unsophisticated, but Sylvia's greatest interest was centred on figures which were too familiar to be mistaken. The whole entertainment was, in truth, but a gorgeous setting to that conversation with Jack, which might be their last tete-a-tete for so long to come. The dressmaker who was preparing Miss Trevor's dress for the great occasion had seldom had more difficulty in satisfying an employer, and the sum total expended on fineries would have horrified Miss Munns if she had been allowed to see the bills. Even Sylvia winced when she added up the figures, but she repeated sturdily the old phrase, "Dad won't mind," and felt secure that she would meet with no worse reprimand than a little good-natured banter. On the whole, she had been very economical during her stay in England, and her conscience did not upbraid her concerning this one extravagance. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A telegram. As soon as her room was in order on the day of the reception, Sylvia began the delightful task of opening boxes and parcels and laying their contents on the bed. The satin skirt was spread out with careful fingers, and over it a foam of frills and flounces which must surely have grown, since it was inconceivable that they could have been fashioned by mortal hands. Fan and gloves and little lacy handkerchief lay side by side on the pillows. Little satin shoes stood at a jaunty angle, the crystal buckles shining in the sun. The pearl necklace, which had been a present from Dad on her 21st birthday, lay on the toilet table ready to be snapped on, and a spray of white roses and maidenhair floated in a basin of water. All was ready, and Sylvia beamed with delight at the result of her preparations. She had come upstairs ostensibly to rest, but in reality she was far too excited to settle down even to read, and could only wander about the room inventing one little duty after another, and weaving endless daydreams. In a corner of the room stood her travelling box, a convenient receptacle into which to put the new purchases as they arrived from the shops. The travelling dress, the piles of cool garments for summer wear, lay neatly packed away, looking fresh and dainty enough to have charmed any girl's heart. But this afternoon Sylvia had no thought for the future. Every hope and ambition was centred on the events of the next few hours. 3 o'clock! How slowly the time passed! 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9! 6 hours still to while away before she would drive from the door with Pixie by her side, and Jack vis-a-vis, leaning forward to look her over and exclaim in admiration at her fine feathers. Sylvia could almost imagine that she heard him speak, and saw the sudden softening of the handsome eyes, and for once in her life she was inclined to rejoice that Bridgie was again staying at Park Lane, since Pixie and Pat would be so much engrossed in their own discussions as to ensure a virtual tete-a-tete for their companions. She rose restlessly from her seat and walked to the window. Was Pixie occupied, even as she had been herself in laying out her dress for the evening? She peered curiously through the opposite windows, but no sign of the inhabitants was to be seen. She yawned, drummed her fingers against the pane, and stared idly down the road. It was not a lively neighbourhood at the best of times, and today it seemed even duller than usual. A nurse was wheeling a perambulator along the pavement. A milkman's cart was making slow progress from door to door. A telegraph boy was sauntering down the middle of the road whistling a popular air. Sylvia wondered where he was going, and what was the nature of the message which he bore. Some people were so nervous about telegrams. Aunt Margaret, for instance. It was so rarely that her quiet life was disturbed by a message of sufficient importance to make it worth while for the sender to expend sixpence on its delivery. Sylvia's heart gave a leap of apprehension as the thought arose that perhaps the message was for the O'Shaughnessy household, to tell of some dire accident which had interfered with the festivity of the evening. She had hardly time to breathe a sigh of relief as the boy passed the gate of number 3, before apprehension reawoke as he approached her own doorway. A telegram for Aunt Margaret? What could it be? Ought she to go downstairs to lend the support of her presence, or stay in her room where she was supposed to be, enjoying a refreshing nap? She heard the opening of the door and the sound of voices in the hall. Then, to her surprise, footsteps ascended the stairs and someone whispered a gentle summons. "Sylvia, are you awake? A telegram has arrived for you, my dear. You had better see it at once." Miss Munns looked flurried and anxious, but her niece smiled a placid reassurement. "I expect it is from father, fixing the date of my journey. He said he would wire." She tore open the envelope and glanced hurriedly at the address. "Yes, it is. He is at Marseilles. Come at—" Her voice died away, and she stood staring at the words in horrified incredulity, while Miss Munns stepped forward hurriedly and peered over her shoulder. "Come at once. Father dangerously ill. Remain in charge till you come. Nisbet. Nisbet! Nisbet, that was the name of the friends with whom he was to travel. Dangerously ill? At once? What can it mean?" Sylvia laid the paper on the bed and pressed her hands against her head. She was deathly pale, but perfectly composed and quiet, and the expression of her eyes showed that, so far from being stunned, she was thinking in quick, capable fashion. "There is a train from Charing Cross at 4 o'clock," she said presently. "I should arrive in Paris at midnight, and at Marseilles sometime tomorrow. It is 3 now. My box is more than half packed. I shall have time. Mary must go out and order a cab." "My dear, it is impossible. You cannot possibly leave to-day." "I will go with you myself, and I cannot get ready in an hour's notice. Wait until tomorrow, and—" Sylvia turned round with a flash of anger in her eyes, but suddenly softened and took both the old lady's hands in her own, holding them in a tender pressure. "Listen," she said, and her voice, gentle though it was, had in it a new quality which awed and impressed the hearer. "Listen! There is not one single minute to spare. If there was a train at 3:30, I should catch that, box or no box, for father is dying, Aunt Margaret. He would not have let me be summoned like this for any passing ailment. Nothing in all the world would make me wait here until tomorrow. So please, dear, do not hinder me now. I know it is impossible for you to come with me, but I will telegraph the moment I arrive, and if there is still time, you can follow then." "But you can't travel alone. Edward would not like it. He is so particular. How can you manage about the trains?" "Listen, I have thought of that too. Put on your bonnet and go to the telephone office at the corner. Ask the people at the agency if they can possibly send a lady courier to meet me at the train at Charing Cross. If they can, very well. If they can't, I am 22. I can speak French easily, and am not afraid of travelling by myself. I will telegraph to Cook's agent to meet me in Paris, if it will make you any happier. But I am going, auntie dear, and I have not a moment to spare. I will get dressed now, and the cab must be here in half an hour." Miss Munns turned without a word and left the room. She had the sense to know when she was beaten, and, having once faced the situation, set to work in her usual businesslike fashion and proved the most capable of helpers. Having been successful in arranging for a lady courier through the convenient medium of the telephone, she returned home to write labels, fasten together cloaks and umbrellas, and order a hasty but tempting little meal for the refreshment of the traveller. This accomplished, she returned once more to the bedroom, where Sylvia was putting the last touches to her packing. Nearly finished? That's right, my dear. You have 8 minutes still, and tea is waiting for you downstairs. Don't trouble to tidy the room. I'll attend to that after you have gone. All these things on the bed, they had better be packed away in the attics, I suppose. It's a pity they were ever bought, as things have turned out. You may never need them now." "No, I may never need them now," said Sylvia steadily. "In 1 minute, aunt, just 1 minute. You go down and pour out my tea, and I'll follow immediately. I've just one thing more I want to do." "Don't dawdle, then. Don't dawdle. Mary will fasten the straps. Don't wait for that." Miss Munns departed unwillingly enough, and Sylvia shut the door after her and gave a swift step back towards the bed. The satin dress and the fan and the gloves and the jaunty little shoes lay there, looking precisely the same as they had done an hour ago. The only difference was in the eyes which beheld them. Sylvia had read of a bride who was buried in her wedding dress, and she felt at this moment as if she were leaving her own girlhood behind, with that mass of dainty white finery. What lay in the future she could not tell. Only one thing seemed certain, that those few words on the slip of brown paper had made a great chasm of separation between it and the past. The opportunity for which she had longed was not to be hers. She must leave England without so much as a word of farewell to the friends who of late had filled such a large part of her life. If her plans had been frustrated by one of the annoying little contretemps of daily life, Sylvia would have exhausted herself in lamentations and repinings. But she was dumb before this great catastrophe, which came so obviously from a higher hand. When her father lay dying, there was no regret in her heart for a lost amusement, but this hurried departure might mean more, much more than the forfeiture of Esmeralda's hospitality. She stretched out her hand and smoothed the satin folds with a very tender touch. "Goodbye," she whispered softly in the silence of the room. "Goodbye, Jack." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Too late. Sylvia's journey was quiet and uneventful, and her companion was tactfully silent, leaving her at peace to think her own thoughts. As time passed by, the natural hopefulness of youth reasserted itself, and she began to think that she had been too hasty in taking it for granted that her father was hopelessly ill. After all, he had not dispatched the telegram. It had been signed by his friends, the Nisbets, who, no doubt, were unwilling to accept a position of responsibility. When she arrived, she would nurse him so devotedly, would surround him with such an atmosphere of love and care, that he could not help recovering and growing strong once more. He would be longing to see her, poor dear old dad, working himself into an invalid's nervous dread, lest they might never meet again, as she herself had done a few months earlier, and the sight of his child would be his best medicine. They left the train and took their places in the boat. It was a cloudless summer afternoon, and the white cliffs stood out in striking contrast to the blue sky and sea. What a change from the big grey city, which even now was beginning to grow close and dusty. What a glorious open prospect for one who had been shut up for months in the confines of a narrow street. And yet Rutland Road had been far more beautiful to one voyager at least, for at that moment, exactly that moment, as timed by the little watch at her wrist, Jack O'Shaughnessy would have turned the corner of the main road to saunter towards his own home. Jack always sauntered, with the air of a gentleman at large who had never known the necessity of hurry. Sylvia had watched him many times from the shelter of her window curtains, and knew exactly how he would carry his head and twirl his stick and glance rapidly across the road as he unlatched the gate. Pixie would open the door and breathlessly unfold the news, with which she had by this time been made acquainted. And how would Jack look then? Would the smile fade away? Would he feel as if all zest and interest had departed from the evening entertainment? Or would he make the best of things in happy O'Shaughnessy fashion, and console himself in Molly's smiles? The breeze grew fresher and more chill, and the stars began to peep. The travellers had reached the shores of France, and far away in London Esmeralda's guests were beginning to arrive. The carriages were jostling one another in the narrow street. Then came Paris, and a space for rest and refreshment before starting on the next stage of the journey. Sylvia had hoped that a telegram might be waiting for her at this point, but none was forthcoming, and its absence was a bitter disappointment, despite the old adage that no news is good news. She sat in the big deserted buffet, drinking bouillon and eating poulet and salad, and catching sight of her own pallid reflection in one of the mirrors, smiled feebly at the contrast between the present and the might have been. This white-faced, weary-looking girl was surely not the Sylvia Trevor whose daydreams had woven such golden things about this very hour. The lady courier engaged a sleeping compartment for the first stage of the long journey to Marseilles, but though it was a comfort to lie down and stretch her weary limbs, there was little sleep for Sylvia that night. She was up and gazing out of the window by 6 o'clock in the morning, and the day seemed endless despite the interest of the scenes through which she passed. "Through thy cornfields green and sunny vines, O pleasant land of France." The lines which she had read in her youth came back to memory as the train crossed the broad waters of the Loire and sped through valleys of grapes and olives, surrounded by hills of smiling green. The sun was hot in these southern plains, and the dust blew in clouds through the windows. It was a relief when evening fell again and brought the end of the long journey. Sylvia stepped onto the platform and looked around with eager gaze. Although she had never met her father's friends, she knew their appearance sufficiently well from photographs and descriptions to be able to distinguish them from strangers, but nowhere could she see either husband or wife. It was unkind to leave her unwelcomed and with no word to allay her anxiety, and she had hard work to keep back her tears as her companion ran about, collecting the scattered pieces of luggage. She was so tired mentally and physically that this last disappointment was too much for her endurance, and she thanked God that in a few minutes the strain would be over and she would be seated by her father's side. They drove along the quaint foreign streets and presently arrived at the hotel itself, a large building set back in a courtyard in which visitors sat before little tables, smoking and drinking their after-dinner coffee. They looked up curiously as Sylvia passed, but no one came forward to meet her, and the waiter gesticulated dumbly in answer to her questionings and led the way upstairs without vouchsafing a word in reply. It was humiliating to think that her accent had so degenerated as to be unrecognizable in his ears, but there was no other explanation, and it was at least evident that she was expected, since he seemed in no doubt as to where to conduct her first. He turned down a corridor to the right, stopped at the second door, and threw it open, and Sylvia saw with surprise that it was not a bedroom, but a sitting room, in which a lady and gentleman were already seated. The gentleman leapt to his feet, wheeled round, and stood with his face to the window. The lady shrank back into her chair then suddenly jumped up and ran forward with outstretched hands. It was Mrs. Nisbet, though looking older and more worn than Sylvia had expected to see her, and nothing could have been kinder or more affectionate than her greeting. "My dear child, my poor dear child, how tired you must be. You've had an awful journey. Come in, dear, and rest a few minutes while I will make some tea for you. English people always like tea, don't they? And I will make it myself, so that it shall be good. Come, dear, sit down. Let me take off your hat." She stroked the girl's cheek with her hand, such a hot, trembling hand, and there was an odd, excited thrill in her voice which filled Sylvia with a vague alarm. She stepped back a step and drew herself up straight and determined. "Thank you very much, but I don't want any tea. I want to go at once to father. It has been such a long, long journey. I mustn't waste any more time." "No, no, but you are not ready just this moment. You must have something to strengthen you first. If you don't wait for tea, there is some wine. Drink a glass, dear, do, to please me." Sylvia stared at her fixedly, and from her to that other figure which stood motionless by the window without so much as a glance for his friend's child. A cold fear seized her in its grip. The room swam before her eyes, and out of the confusion she heard a weak voice saying brokenly, "Tell me quickly, please. It won't help me to drink wine. Father—" Mrs. Nisbet burst into a passion of tears and clasped the girl tightly in her arms. "You are too late, dear. An hour too late. We did everything we could. He left you his last love and blessing." It was all over. The 2 long days of waiting, the last glimpse of Dad's still face, the funeral in the foreign cemetery, and Sylvia sat alone in the hotel sitting room, striving to recover sufficiently from the shock to decide on the next step which lay before her. In the crushing weight of the new sorrow it seemed as if it were impossible to go on living at all. Yet it was absolutely necessary to make her plans, for she could not be an indefinite burden on her father's friends. They had come home to enjoy a hard-earned rest, and as the holiday had begun so sadly, there was all the more reason why the remainder should be passed under cheerful conditions. Mr. and Mrs. Nisbet had pressed the girl to spend the next few months travelling in their company, but Sylvia was resolute in her refusal. "I should be a constant care to you and a constant killjoy, and that would be a poor return for all you've done for me," she said sadly. "It will comfort me all my life to remember that you were with Dad during those last dreadful days, and some day I should like very much to visit you when I can be a pleasure instead of a burden. It does not seem now as if I could ever be happy again, but I suppose it will come in time." "It will, if you trust in God and ask Him to help you. He sends troubles to teach us lessons, dear, and to draw our thoughts to Him, but never, never to make us miserable," said Mrs. Nisbet softly. "You did not feel that you had lost your father when he was far off in India, and he is a great deal nearer to you now in the spirit world. Never think of him as in the grave. Think of him in heaven, and it will grow dear and homelike to you just because he is there. It would have grieved him to the heart to see your young life clouded. So you must try to be happy for his sake. I don't mean by that you can be lively or care for the old amusements. That can only come with time. But unhappiness comes from rebellion against God's will. And if you submit to that and leave your life in His hands, you will find that all the sting has gone out of your trouble." The slow tears rose and stood in Sylvia's eyes. "Thank you," she said meekly. "I will try, but it's hard to be resigned when one is young and all one's life seems shattered. I don't know what to do next. Every arrangement so far has been made till Dad comes home, and now that Hope is gone, and what am I to do? I have no home and no work, and nobody needs me. Aunt Margaret would take me in, of course, but she would not like it as a permanency any more than I should myself. She has her own way, and I have mine, and we did not agree very well. She was very kind when she thought I was going away, but at the bottom of her heart she was glad. She doesn't need me, you see. I don't help her at all." "But you could make her need you. You could help her if you went back, determined to make it your work in life." Mrs. Nisbet took the girl's hand in hers and pressed it gently, and Sylvia looked into her face with miserable, honest eyes. "Yes, I could. I could shut my lips up tight and never answer back, and look interested when I was bored, and go little walks up and down the terrace, and play cribbage when I wanted to read, and read aloud dull books when I wanted to read lively ones to myself, and pretend to like what I really hate and detest." "Poor lassie, it does sound dull. I'll tell you a secret, though. It would not be pretense very long, for it is one of the blessed recompenses in life that if we conquer self and perform a duty wholeheartedly and cheerfully, it is distasteful no longer, but becomes more interesting than we could have believed possible in the old rebellious days." "Does it? But I don't think I quite want to be satisfied with that kind of life," Sylvia said slowly. "I don't wish to seem disrespectful, but really and truly, Aunt Margaret's ideas are terribly narrow and old-fashioned, and I shouldn't like it a bit if I were like her when I was old. I've managed pretty well so far, for I had nice friends, and was always looking forward to the time when I should have my own home. But don't you understand how different it is now, and how dreary it seems to settle down to it as a permanency?" She looked up wistfully in Mrs. Nisbet's face and met a smile of kindest understanding. "But there is no necessity to grieve over the future, child. At your age, arrangements are rarely permanent, and you are concerned only with the next step. It seems for the moment as if it were the right course to return to London, so try to look upon the situation from a new standpoint and face it bravely. Forget your aunt's shortcomings, and remember only that she is your father's only remaining relative, the playmate and companion of his youth, and that you are connected by a common sorrow and a common loss. Set yourself to brighten her life, and to fill it with wider interests. Forget yourself, in short, and think about other people. When you have learned that lesson, dear, you will have solved the great secret of life, and found the key to happiness and peace of mind." "Yes," sighed Sylvia, faintly. It sounded very sweet and very beautiful, but oh, so terribly difficult to accomplish. If it had been a big thing, one great heroic sacrifice which she was called upon to make, she could have braced herself to the effort, and have borne it with courage. But the little daily pinpricks, the chafings of temper, the weariness of uncongenial companionship, these were the hardest test, the most cruel tax upon endurance. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the same uneventful, monotonous existence. And suppose for one moment that Jack married Molly Burrell, and Bridgie returned to her Irish home. Sylvia shivered and shut her eyes as at an unbearable prospect, and Mrs. Nisbet's voice said softly in her ear, "I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me. Take each day as it comes, dear, and try to live it bravely without thinking of tomorrow. We will travel with you as far as Paris and have a few days together before you go on to London. I wish you would have stayed with us longer, but perhaps it will be better for us all to be apart for a time and meet again later on. We shall be in London in autumn, and one of my first visits will be to you. Your father has been like a brother to my husband for years past, and we shall always feel a very close interest in your welfare. By the way, dear, how are you off for money? Would it be a convenience if I lent you some to pay for mourning and the return journey? You came away expecting to be responsible for a few days only, and as you know, when a man dies, it is not possible to touch his money until certain legal formalities have been observed. We should be only too delighted to act as your bankers until matters are settled. Thank you very much, but I think I shall have enough. I drew out what money was in the bank before leaving home, and I would rather not get into debt until I know exactly how I am placed. There may be very little left. Father always spoke as if he were poor." "He told you nothing about his affairs, then? You know nothing about them?" Mrs. Nisbet looked at her curiously as she spoke, and Sylvia's heart gave a throb of fear. She knew something. There was evidently some secret with which she herself was unacquainted, and in her present depressed condition of mind and body, it was only natural that she should leap to the conclusion that the news must be bad, and, ostrich-like, tried to hide her head in the sand. "He told me there had been some changes lately which I should not understand. His lawyers will write to me sometime, I suppose, but I don't want to think about money yet. I have sufficient for the next few months, for I shall go nowhere and need no more clothes." Yes, dear, it's all right. You will get along nicely, I'm sure," said the other soothingly, and Sylvia felt another thrill of foreboding. Get along nicely? Did that mean she would have to earn her own living? She dared not inquire further, shrinking from the possibility of another blow, but it was impossible to keep from wondering what she should do if indeed there was no provision for her support. Pixie's adventures in search of employment had proved how difficult it was for an inexperienced girl to escape becoming the prey of fraudulent advertisements, and it was humiliating to reflect on her own incapacity. What could she do that 1,000 other girls could not accomplish equally well? She could play fairly well, sing fairly well, paint fairly well, trim a hat so that it did not look obviously homemade, make a trifle or creams, though she was densely ignorant about boiling a potato. She possessed, in fact, a smattering of many things, but had not really mastered one, which, if needs be, would be a staff through life. 100 poor girls find themselves in this position every year, yet their short-sighted sisters continue to fritter away their time, oblivious of the fact that to them also may come the rainy day when they must face the world alone. Learn to do one thing well, compare your productions, whatever they may be, not with those of other amateurs, but with perfected professional specimens, and do not be content until your own reach the same standard. This is a golden rule which every girl ought to take to heart. During the 10 days which elapsed before Sylvia's return to London, she was haunted by the fear of monetary troubles, which would make her either dependent on her own efforts or a burden upon her aunt's narrow income. But neither Mrs. Nisbet nor her husband referred again to the subject, and some time must still elapse before she could hear from her father's lawyer in Colombo. The week in Paris passed away quietly, but more pleasantly than she could have believed possible under the circumstances, for nothing could have been kinder or more considerate than the way in which she was treated by her father's friends, while the brilliant sunshine acted as a tonic to the spirits. Every day they went long drives in the Bois, or took the train to Versailles, and spent long, quiet hours in the woods, and Sylvia even found herself able to enjoy a visit to one of the huge magazines where Mrs. Nisbet invested in quite a collection of presents to send home to English friends. Sylvia was tempted to buy some on her own account, and it was a new and depressing experience to feel that she must not spend an unnecessary penny. Her little hoard was diminishing rapidly, and she was growing more and more anxious to be safest home, and free from at least immediate anxiety. There was no lady courier to accompany her on this journey, for the days of independence had begun, and she preferred to be alone to wrestle with her forebodings and try to bring herself into a fitting frame of mind for that trying return to the old scenes. The parting from the Nisbets was like saying goodbye once more to the dear dad, and she felt hopelessly adrift without their wise and tender counsels, and the feeling of loneliness grew ever deeper and deeper as she approached the English shores. The great shock through which she had passed had loosened all the ties in life, and made the friends of a few weeks ago seem but the merest of acquaintances. Bridgie had written the sweetest of sympathetic letters, but sorry though she might be, the force of circumstances kept the two girls so far apart that what had been the saddest time in her friend's life had seen the climax of her own gaiety. She had been dancing and singing and pleasure-making while Sylvia shed the bitter tears of bereavement, and in a few weeks more she would be spirited off in Esmeralda's train to another scene of gaiety. The O'Shaughnessys were by nature so light of heart that they might not care to welcome among them a black-robed figure of grief. Sylvia felt as though the whole wide world yawned between her and the old interests, and did not yet realize that this feeling of aloofness from the world and its interests is one of the invariable accompaniments of grief. She was young and not given to serious reflection, and she knew only that she was tired and miserable, that the white cliffs about which she had been accustomed to speak with patriotic fervour looked bleak and cheerless in the light of a wet and chilly evening. June though it was, she was glad to wrap herself in her cloak and pull her umbrella over her head as she passed down the gangway onto the stage. In Paris it had been a glorious summer day, and the change to wet and gloom seemed typical of the homecoming before her. The cloaked and mackintoshed figures on the stage seemed all black, all the same. She would not look at them lest their presence should make her realize more keenly her own loneliness. But someone came up beside her as she struggled through the crowd, and forcibly lifted the bag from her hand. She turned in alarm, and saw a man's tall figure, lifted her eyes, and felt her troubles and anxieties drop from her like a cloak. It was Jack O'Shaughnessy himself. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Comforter. Think of it. Think of it. The grey, inhospitable skies, the rain-swept stage, the feeling of hopeless loneliness as one traveller after another was greeted with loving exclamations and borne away by friendly watchers, and then suddenly to feel your hand grasped and laid tenderly on a protecting arm, and to see, looking into your own face, the face of all others which you would have wished for had the choice been given, to feel no longer a helpless unit, belonging to no one and having no corner of the earth to call your own, but to know that someone had watched for your arrival, and to read how you had been missed in the flash of eloquent eyes. "Oh, Jack!" cried Sylvia involuntarily. "Oh, Jack!" and clung to his arms with a sob of pure joy and thanksgiving. "Oh, I am so glad! I was so lonely. Whatever made you come?" "A great many reasons, but principally because I couldn't stay away," replied Jack, not smiling as was his wont, but looking down upon her with an intent scrutiny which aroused Sylvia's curiosity. She did not realise how changed she was by the experience of the last few weeks, or what a pathetic little face it was which looked up at him between the dead black of hat and cape. The brown eyes looked bigger than ever. The delicate aquiline of the features showed all the more distinctly for their sharpened pallor, and Jack looked down at her through the mist and thanked God for the health and strength which made him a fitting protector for her weakness. The sound of that involuntary "Oh, Jack!" rang sweetly in his ears, and gave a greater confidence to his manner as he steered her through the crowd. "Miss Munns told us when you were expected, and we talked of meeting you at the station, but I decided that I had better stay away. Then I wrote a letter to welcome you, and tore it up. Then, for no purpose at all, I began looking at Bradshaw, and it seemed there was a train which I could catch, and it rained. It's dismal arriving in the rain. Next thing I knew I was in the station, and the train started when I was sitting inside, and here I am." Sylvia laughed softly. It was such an age since she had laughed, and it was such a happy, contented little sound that she was quite startled thereat. The custom house officials were going through the farce of examining the luggage, and while the rest of the passengers groaned and lamented at the delay, Jack and his companion stood together in the background, blissfully unconscious of time and damp. "Are you glad to see me, Sylvia?" he asked, for the joy of hearing her say in words what voice and eyes had already proclaimed. And she waved her hand round the bleak landscape and said tersely, "Look, it felt like that, black and empty and heartbreaking, and all the others seemed to have friends, everyone but me. I think I was never so glad before. I shall bless you for coming all my life." Jack laughed softly and pressed her hand against his arm. "Poor little girl, I knew just how you would be feeling. That's why I came. Wouldn't you have come to meet me if you had been the man and I the girl?" "Yes, to the ends of the earth," Sylvia replied, but not with her lips, for there are some things which a self-respecting girl may not say, however much she may feel them. Instead, she murmured a few non-committal phrases, and gave the conversation a less personal tone by inquiring after the various friends at home, Miss Munns, Bridgie, Pixie and the boys, and Jack answered in his usual breezy fashion, relating little incidents which made Sylvia smile with the old, happy sense of friendship, repeating loving speeches which brought the grateful tears to her eyes. The world was not empty after all, while she possessed such faithful, loving friends. When the luggage had passed the inspection of the custom house and received the magic mark in chalk, Jack led the way down the platform before which the train was already drawn up, and passed by one carriage after another, until at last an empty compartment was discovered, of which he immediately took possession. "Now we can talk," he said, and sat himself down opposite Sylvia, looking at her with compassionate eyes. "I have gone through it myself," he said. "Tell me all you can." And as the train steamed onward, Sylvia told the story of the past weeks, told it quietly and without breakdown, though the dark eyes grew moist and tears trembled on the lashes, which looked so long and black against the white cheeks. It was a comfort to tell it all to one who understood and was full of sympathy and kindness, and, strange though it might seem, separation, instead of widening the distance between Jack and herself, had only drawn them more closely together. The old formalities of intercourse had dropped like a cloak at the first moment of meeting. They were no longer Miss and Mr., but Jack and Sylvia. No longer acquaintances, but dear and intimate friends. "Miss Munns has been terribly distressed," Jack said, when at last the sad recital came to an end. She loved your father more than anyone in the world, and you come next as his child. Poor old lady. It was quite pathetic to see her efforts to make your homecoming as cheerful as possible. Bridgie says she has put up clean curtains all over the house and discussed the menu for supper for the last week. It's her way of showing sympathy, the creature, and you understand better than myself all that it means. Different people have different ways, haven't they, Sylvia? I came to Dover." "Yes," assented Sylvia with a flickering smile. "You came to Dover, and Aunt Margaret put up clean curtains and ordered a roast fowl for supper. I know it will be a roast fowl, and if you had not warned me in time, I should probably have said I could not eat anything, and gone to bed supperless without even noticing the curtains. I'm afraid I've been horrid to the poor old soul in that sort of way many times in the last 2 years. It is good of her to take such trouble, because, honestly speaking, she won't be any more pleased to have me back as a permanency than I am to come. We have mutually comforted ourselves with the reflection that it was only for a time, but now it is different. I want to be good. I have made, such a crowd of good resolutions, but I don't know how long they will last." Jack looked down at his boots and drew his brows together thoughtfully. It's too early, I suppose, to have made any plans for the future. You hardly know what you will do?" "No. My natural home is, of course, with Aunt Margaret as father's sister, but there are other considerations." Sylvia hesitated a moment, then added impetuously. It seemed so natural to confide in Jack. "About money, I mean. I don't know what I have, or if I have anything at all. Father always said he was poor, though he seemed to have enough for what he wanted and to give me all I asked. Perhaps he made enough to keep us, but had nothing to leave behind. Mrs. Nisbet just referred to the subject one evening, and I could see from her manner that there was something I did not know, so I turned the conversation at once. I had had so much trouble that I felt as if I simply could not bear any more bad news just then, and would rather remain in ignorance as long as possible. It was weak, perhaps, but can't you understand the feeling?" "Me name's O'Shaughnessy," said Jack simply. "We never face a disagreeable fact until it comes so close that we hit ourselves against it. I'm sorry, but don't worry more than you can help. I've been short of money all my life, but I don't know anyone who has had a better time. So long as you have youth and health, what does it matter whether you are rich or poor? It's all in the way you look at things. For useful purposes, most people can make their money go farther than mine, but for sheer fun and enjoyment, I'll back my half-crown against another fellow's sovereign." "Oh, but you're Irish. You have the happy temperament which can throw off troubles and forget all about them for the time being. They sit right down upon my shoulders, little black imps of care and anxiety and quaking fears, and press so heavily that I can remember nothing else. Perhaps I could be philosophical too, if I were one of a big happy family. But when one is all alone..." "All alone? When I'm here? How can you be all alone when there are 2 of ye?" cried Jack impulsively. He had resolved, not once, but 100 times over, that he would speak no words but those of friendship, that no temptation, however strong, should make him break his vow of silence, but some impulses seem independent of thought. He did not know what he was going to do. He was conscious of no mental prompting, but one moment he was quietly sitting in his corner opposite Sylvia, and the next he was seated beside her, with both arms wrapped tightly round her trembling figure, and she was shedding tears of mingled sorrow and happiness upon his shoulder. "I've been in love with you ever since the first evening you came to our house. Before that, ever since I saw you sitting up at your window in your little red jacket. You knew it, didn't you? You found that out for yourself?" "No, yes, sometimes. Only I was afraid it couldn't be true, and there was Molly. faltered Sylvia incoherently, hardly knowing what she was saying, conscious of nothing but an overwhelming sense of content and well-being, as the strong arm supported her tired back, and the big, tender finger wiped away her tears. Jack laughed at the suggestion, but did not indulge in the depreciatory remarks concerning Miss Burrell which many men would have used under the circumstances. "Good old Molly," he said. "She's a broth of a girl, but I would as soon think of marrying Bridgie herself. She was my confidante, bless her, and cheered me up when I was down on my luck. You might have noticed how interested she was in you that night at Esmeralda's crush." At that Sylvia opened her eyes wide with a sudden unpleasant recollection. "What will Esmeralda think? Oh, Jack, what will she say?" "Plenty, my dear, you may be sure of that," replied Jack, laughing. Then he too gave a little start of surprise, and, straightening himself, held Sylvia from him at the length of his strong young arms. "I say, what's this? You little witch, what have you done to me? I had made a solemn vow not to speak a word of love-making, and it seems to me I have broken it pretty successfully. Have I been making love to you, Sylvia? Have I?" It was a very charming little face that laughed back at him, pale no longer, but flushed to a delicate pink, the dark eyes a sparkle with happiness and a tinge of the old mischievous spirit. "Yes, you have. Do you want to draw back?" Jack's answer was wordless but convincing, but the next moment he sobered and said in that charming way of his, which was at once so manly and so boyish, "But I didn't want to bind you. I spoke only for myself. I am your property, darling, and your slave to command, but I can't ask you to marry me yet awhile, for I've the children on my hands, and until they are settled I can't think of myself. I am head of the house, and must do what I can for them, poor creatures. Pat will be off to the agricultural college next term, and then back to Ireland to do agent's work. Miles is doing well in the city, but can't keep himself for several years to come. And then there are the girls. I had no right to speak as I did. It wasn't fair to you. I won't bind you down to a long, uncertain engagement. You must feel yourself free, perfectly free." "I don't want to be free. I like to be bound to you, Jack," Sylvia said firmly. "I'm so thankful that you did speak, for it makes just all the difference in my life. I am young, and can wait quite happily and contentedly so long as I know that you care, and can look forward—" Sylvia stopped short, awed at the prospect of happiness which had suddenly opened before her, and Jack was silent too, holding her hand in a close pressure. His face was very tender but troubled through all its tenderness, and when he spoke again it was in very anxious accents. "But are you contented to leave it a secret, darling? A secret between you and me? You see, if Bridgie knew we were waiting, she'd know no peace, feeling that she was in our way, and the young ones would get the same fancy and be wanting to turn out before they were ready. They have no one but me, and I couldn't have them feeling upset in their own home. That was why I determined to keep silent, and it's bad of me to have broken my vow, but it's your own fault, darling. I couldn't be with you again and keep quiet. Do you care for me enough to wait, perhaps for years, before we can even be publicly engaged?" Sylvia smiled at him bravely, but her heart sank a little, poor girl, as it was only natural it should do. A girl is by nature much quicker than a man projecting herself into the future, and in realizing all that is involved. Jack was conscious only of a general regret that he could not claim his bride before the world, but Sylvia saw in a flash the impossibility of frequent meetings, the minute chance of tete-a-tetes, the quicksands in the shape of misunderstandings which must needs attend so unnatural a position. On the other hand, she honoured Jack the more for his loyalty to his home duties and agreed with the wisdom of his decision. "Yes, Jack, I do. I'd like to wait. I love Bridgie with all my heart, and could not bear her to suffer through me. It shall be exactly as you think best for them, in every way." Jack bent and kissed her, even more tenderly than before. "My little helpmeet," he said, and Sylvia found her best reward in the sound of that word, and the knowledge that she was strengthening him in the right path. Surely it was the best guarantee for the happiness of their new relationship that it was inaugurated in a spirit of self-sacrifice and care for others. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reminiscences. Bridgie was not waiting at the station. "She heard me saying that I might be here myself, and maybe remembered that two are company," said Jack with a laugh. But when Rutland Road was reached, someone stood waiting to open the door of the cab and welcome the wanderer in the sweetest tones of a sweet contralto voice. She said only a few words, but with true Irish tact chose just the ones which were most comforting under the circumstances. "Welcome back, dear. I've missed you badly. So have we all." Then she looked at Jack and smiled as if his presence were the most natural thing in the world. "You have brought her home safely. That's right," she said. It was one of Bridgie's most lovable qualities that she never asked awkward questions, nor showed undue curiosity about the affairs of others. Brother and sister said goodbye at the door, leaving aunt and niece alone, and as the door closed behind them, Sylvia felt a spasm of loneliness and regret. It was hard to part from Jack with that formal shake of the hand, to feel that days might elapse before they met again, and as she looked round the ugly little dining room, she felt like a prisoned bird which longs to break loose the bars and fly to its mate. It seemed impossible to settle down to the old monotonous life, and yet how much worse it might have been. How thankful she ought to be! If one hope had been taken away, another had been granted in its stead. The path ahead was still bright with promise, and a sudden pity seized her for the woman whose youth was gone, and who had lost the last tie to the past. She returned her aunt's kisses with unusual affection, and roused herself to notice and show appreciation of the efforts which had been made on her behalf. The table was laid with the best china. The red satin tea cosy had been brought from its hiding place upstairs and divested of its muslin bag and holland wrappings. The centre mat, presented by Cousin Mary Ferguson 2 Christmases ago, was displayed for the first time. The serviettes were folded into rakish imitations of cocked hats. It was half touching, half gruesome, to find the occasion turned into a fete. But Sylvia was determined to be amiable, and said gratefully, "How kind of you to have supper ready for me, Aunt Margaret. I could not eat anything on the boat, but now I believe I am hungry. It all looks very good. The chickens one gets in France are not the least like the ones at home." "They don't know how to feed them, my dear. I am glad you have an appetite. I always find that when I am in trouble, nothing tempts me so much as a cup of tea and a slice off the breast. Just take off your hat and sit down as you are. Everything is ready." Miss Munns was evidently gratified to receive an acknowledgment of her efforts, and insisted upon waiting upon her niece and loading her plate with one good thing after another. But after the meal was over, there followed a painful half-hour, when Sylvia had to submit to a searching cross-questioning on the events of the past weeks. Unlike Bridgie, Miss Munns insisted upon detail. had a ghoulish curiosity to know in exactly what words Mrs. Nisbet had broken the sad news, in exactly what words Sylvia had replied, in exactly what manner the first black days had been spent. Her spectacles were dimmed with tears as she listened to what the girl had to tell, and her thin lips quivered with a genuine grief. But she was still acutely interested to hear of the number of carriages at the funeral, of the meals in the hotel, and the purchase of Sylvia's mourning garments. "You must show them to me tomorrow. I expect they are very smart, coming from France. I always wear black, so there was not much to be done. I had the black satin taken off my cashmere dress, and folds of crepe put in its place, and some dull trimming instead of jet on my cape. I haven't decided about my bonnet. You must give me your advice. Of course, I wish to do everything that is proper, but it's been an expensive year." "Yes," assented Sylvia absently. She rose from her seat and, walking across the room, leant her elbow on the mantelpiece. There was something she wanted to say, and it was easier to say it with averted face. "Aunt Margaret, I want to ask you a question. Please tell me the truth. Shall I have any money? Was father able to provide for me? I know you are not well off, and I could not bear to be a burden to you. If I have no money of my own, I must try to earn some." "I should be telling you the truth, my dear, if I said that I knew less about it than you do yourself. Your father was very close about business matters, very close indeed. He was supposed to have a good business a few years ago, and was always very handsome in his ways, but he has grumbled a good deal of late, and I don't know how things will be now he is gone. He had a lawsuit with an old partner in Ceylon which hung on a long time. I don't know if it is settled yet, and if not, we shall have to let it drop. You can always have a home with me, but there will be nothing to spare for lawyers' expenses. Give me a bird in the hand, as I said to your father the last time he was home. If the worst comes to the worst, you can give some music lessons in the neighbourhood. Mrs. Burton was telling me on Monday that her little boy has quite a taste, picks out all the barrel organ tunes on the piano with one finger. You might get him as a beginning." "Yes," assented Sylvia faintly, and to herself she cried, "Oh, Jack dear, how good of you to love me! How good of you to give me something to live for! How dreadful, dreadful, dreadful I should be feeling now if you had not met me and made the whole world different!" Miss Munns was watching her anxiously, fearing a burst of tears, and was greatly relieved when she turned round and showed a composed and even smiling face. "I'll find some work if it is necessary, auntie. I'll try to help you too. You've been very good to me, and I'm afraid I have been rather horrid sometimes. I thought of it when I was away, and determined to make a fresh start if you would forgive me this time. We're the only two left, and we ought to love each other." "I'm sure I am very much attached to you, my dear. I was saying so to Miss O'Shaughnessy only to-day. I don't deny that your manner is rather sharp at times, but there's nothing like trouble for taming the spirits. I shouldn't wonder if we got along much more happily after this. Miss Bridgie brought a little parcel for you. I mustn't forget that. It's on that little table. She told me to give it to you at once." "What can it be, I wonder? Something I left over there? By mistake, I suppose," Sylvia said listlessly as she unfolded the paper, but her expression altered the next moment as she beheld a flat leather case, inside which reposed a miniature painting of the same face which used to smile upon her from her own chimney-piece. Surprise held her speechless, while a quick rush of tears testified more eloquently than words to the faithfulness of the portrait. The painting was exquisitely fine and soft, the setting the perfection of good taste in its handsome severity. It seemed at the moment just the greatest treasure which the world could offer. Who could have sent it? Sylvia reluctantly handed the case for Miss Munn's curious scrutiny, while she opened the note which had fallen from the paper. Bridgie's handwriting confronted her, but she had hardly time to marvel how so costly a gift could come from such an impecunious donor before surprise number 2 confronted her in the opening words. Esmeralda told me to give you this miniature from myself, but I want you to know that it is entirely her idea and present from the beginning. As soon as she heard your sad news, she asked me to borrow the best photograph of your father to be copied by the same artist who painted the Major for her. She has been to see how he was getting on almost every day, till the poor man was thankful to finish it just to be rid of her. And here it is to welcome you, dear, and we hope be a comfort to you all your life." "Esmeralda?" echoed Sylvia blankly. It seemed for a moment as if Bridgie must be romancing, for the staid English mind refused to believe that one who had at one time appeared actively antagonistic, and at the best had shown nothing warmer than a lofty tolerance, should suddenly become the most thoughtful and generous of friends. Yet there it was, specified in black and white. Esmeralda had originated the kindly plan. She had engaged no second-rate artist, but one to whom her own work had been entrusted, and had given freely of what was even more value to her than money, her time, in order that the gift should arrive at the right moment. Sylvia flushed with a gratification which was twofold in its nature, for here at last seemed an opening of drawing near in heart to that beautiful, baffling personality who was Jack's sister, and might some day, oh wonderful thought, be her own also. It would be a triumph indeed if in these days of waiting she could overcome the last lingering prejudice, and feel that there would be no dissentient note when at last the great secret was revealed. Aunt and niece hung together over the case with its precious contents, the one exhausting herself in expressions of gratitude and appreciation, the other equally delighted, but quite unable to resist looking the gift horse in the mouth, and speculating in awed tones concerning the enormous cost of ivory miniatures. That jarred, but on the whole the evening passed more pleasantly than Sylvia could have believed possible, the unexpected excitement breaking the thread of that painful cross-examination, and carrying the old lady's thoughts back to the far-off days when she and her brother had been sworn friends and playmates. "Tell me what you used to do, auntie. It must be so nice to have someone to play with. Do tell me some of your escapades," she pleaded wistfully, and Miss Munns shook her head and assumed a great air of disapproval, though it was easy to see that she cherished a secret pride in the remembrance of her own audacities. "I'm afraid we were very naughty, thankless children. One day, I remember, Teddy, as we used to call him, had been very rightly punished for disobedience, and he confided in me that he intended to run away and go to sea as a cabin boy. We always did everything together in those days, so of course nothing must suit me but I must go too. We got up early the next morning and ran out into the garden where we were allowed to play before breakfast, then slipped out of the side door to walk to Portsmouth. Portsmouth was 18 miles away and I was only 6, and before we had walked 2 miles I was crying with fatigue and hunger. Teddy had brought some bread and butter, so we sat under a hedge to eat it, and he told me we must be very nearly there. Just then up came a tramp and stopped to ask why we were crying and what we were doing out there in the road at that hour in the morning. "We are going to Portsmouth to be cabin boys," we told him, and I can remember to this day how he laughed. "If you are going to be cabin boys, you won't want those clothes," he said. "You had better take them off and give them to me to change for proper sailor things." We thought that a splendid idea, so he took Teddy's suit and my frock and hat and left us shivering under the hedge, waiting his return. Of course, he never came, and an hour or two later my father came driving along to look for us, and we were taken home and punished as we deserved. That is to say, Teddy was whipped, and I was only put to bed, for he insisted that the idea was his and that he alone was to blame. "Oh, nice little Teddy," murmured Sylvia fondly, looking down at the pictured face, which, despite grey hair and wrinkles, had still the gallant air of the little boy who shielded his sister from blame. Having once started, Miss Munns told one story after another of her childhood days, of the lessons which brother and sister used to learn together, a whole page of Magnol's questions at a time, and of the dire and terrible conspiracy by which they learnt alternate answers, easily persuading the docile governess to take the right turns. Thus Teddy, when asked, "What is starch?" could reply with prompt accuracy, while remaining in dense ignorance of the date when printing was introduced into England, concerning which his small sister was so well informed. Sylvia was told of the books which were read and reread until the pages came loose from their bindings, of the thrilling adventures of one Masterman Ready, whose stockade being besieged by savages, it became an immediate necessity to guard the gate at the head of the nursery stairs, and to hurl a succession of broken toys at the innocent nurse as she forced an entry; of a misguided and stubborn Rosamond who expended her savings on a large purple vase from a chemist's window, and found to her chagrin that when the water was poured away it was only a plain glass bottle; and of a certain Layla who sojourned on a desert island in the utmost comfort and luxury, being possessed of a clever father who found all that he needed on the trees in the forest. An hour later, when Sylvia went up to her room, it was impossible to resist drawing aside the blind to look across the road, and in an instant another blind was pulled back, and a tall, dark figure stood clearly outlined against the lighted background. Sylvia understood that Jack had been watching for her advent, and felt comforted by his presence and all that was meant by that waving hand. She wondered whether she had better write to Esmeralda or try to see her in person, but the question was decided by Pixie, who came over early the next morning to announce Mrs. Hilliard's arrival in the afternoon. "She wants to see you and say she's sorry," she explained, and when Sylvia exhausted herself in expressions of gratitude and delight, "Oh, Esmeralda would give you her skin if it would fit ye," she said coolly. "She's the kindest of us all when she isn't cross. Give her her way and you may have all the rest. I've known her raise the roof on us, and appealing to every relation we owned to get what she wanted, and then wrap it up in brown paper that very day and post it back where it came. I'm glad ye like it so much. Now, if I'd been clever and bought some more paints when those people wanted me, maybe I could have done it for you myself." Her face grew suddenly grave and wistful. "When I got my telegram at school, the girls all brought me home presents from the walk, pencil boxes and jujubes, and a little toy rabbit that wagged its head. I don't know how it was, but they soothed my feelings. I should have liked to buy you something, Sylvia, but I don't get my wages till the end of the month, and then they are spent. You'll excuse me, won't you, me dear, for you know I am sorry." "My darling girl, I don't want presents. Come to see me as often as you can, and go on being fond of me. That's all I want," cried Sylvia warmly, and Pixie brightened once more. "There's no credit in that. It isn't as if you were nasty. I'll not be able to call on ye as often as I'd like, for I'm off to the seaside. Mrs. Wallace has taken a house on the Thames. And her cousin is coming home from the wars, and a friend with him, and lots of ladies and gentlemen all staying in the house to be entertained, so they want me to go too, of course." "Of course," repeated Sylvia gravely. There was something so charming in Pixie's simple assumption that everyone desired her company, that she would not for the world have tried to destroy it. "I hope you will enjoy yourself very much, dear, and come back with some colour in your cheeks, though I am afraid that particular part of the seaside is not very bracing. Tell Mrs. Hilliard, with my love, that I shall be charmed to see her this afternoon." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George D. Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Esmeralda's visit. Miss Munns was greatly excited to hear of the expected visit, and busied herself taking the holland covers off the drawing-room chairs, and displaying the best antimacassars in the most advantageous position. Sylvia longed to introduce a little disorder into the painful severity of the room, but it would have distressed her aunt if she had moved a chair out of the straight, or confiscated one of the books which were ranged at equal distances round the rosewood table, and as it was one of her resolves not to interfere with domestic arrangements, she shrugged her shoulders resignedly, and hoped that Esmeralda might be as unnoticing of her surroundings as were her brothers and sisters. At 4 o'clock a carriage drove up to the door, and Esmeralda alighted, clad from head to foot in black, as Sylvia noticed at the first quick glance. She was waiting in the little drawing-room, and scarcely was the door opened when the tall figure was at her side, and her hands were crushed with affectionate fervour. She looked up, and was startled by the beauty of the face above her, startled as even Esmeralda's brothers and sisters were at times, when, as now, the grey eyes were misty with tears, and the lips all sweet and tremulous. "If I'd known, if I'd had the slightest idea he was ill, I would rather have killed myself than have behaved as I did. Oh, don't pretend you didn't notice. I was hateful to you when you were ill, too. Poor creature! And my sister's guest. I told Geoff all about it. I hate telling him when I do wrong, so I did it just as a penance, and he was so vexed with me. Do you know why I spoke as I did? Did you guess the reason?" Sylvia shrank into herself with an uneasy foreboding, for Esmeralda was an impetuous creature who might be expected to be as undisguised in her penitence as in offence. "Oh, please don't say anything more about it," she cried hurriedly. "It was very trying for you finding me there when you came over for a visit. I have forgotten all about it, if there is anything to forget. And now there's this lovely miniature. How can I thank you?" "Oh, that is nothing, that's nothing!" cried Esmeralda, waving aside the subject, and insisting upon a full confession of her fault. "I was jealous of you, that is what it was. Jealous because they all seemed so fond of you, and I wanted their attention for myself. It was horribly mean, because I have Geoff and the boy, and it is only natural that they should want their own interests. I dare say Pixie has told you how father spoiled me all my life, and Bridgie gave way to me until it seemed natural to think first of myself, but I don't now. I think of Geoffrey and the boy, and I'm trying to be better for their sake. Geoff says he got me only just in time. He is rather stern with me sometimes, do you know. He doesn't say much. Perhaps I don't give him the chance. But his face sets, and his eyes are so large and grave. I can't bear it when he looks at me like that. Because as a rule, you know..." She gave a soft, happy little laugh. He loves me so frightfully much, and we are so happy together. I ought to want every girl to be as happy as I am, and I do. Really, I do. In a month or two, when we are home at Knock, will you come and stay with me, Sylvia, and learn to be fond of me too? I'm rather lonely over there now that all the others have left, and I have not many girl friends. The one I cared for most will be engaged soon, I think, and the man lives abroad, so she may be leaving the neighbourhood. It is not settled yet, but I think Mrs. Burrell will give in." She stared ostentatiously through the window, and Sylvia blushed and had some ado not to smile at this very transparent intimation of hostility withdrawn. "Thank you so much. I'd love to come," she said simply, and then the two girls talked quietly for a few minutes before Miss Munns came in and dispensed tea and reminiscences of all the grand people whom she had ever met, with a view of impressing her visitor, who, of course, was not impressed at all, but secretly amused, as listeners invariably are under such circumstances. Esmeralda was just rising to leave when a loud rat-tat at the knocker made Sylvia's heart leap in expectation, and the next moment Jack came into the room in his most easy and assured manner. "I thought I would come across for my sister and inquire how Miss Trevor was after her journey," he announced, and once more Sylvia smiled to herself as she noted how Esmeralda immediately plunged into animated conversation with Miss Munns, to keep her attention engrossed at the opposite end of the room. Jack O'Shaughnessy stood by the window and looked down upon his little love with tender, dissatisfied eyes. "I say," he said softly, "I can't stand this sort of thing. 2 minutes' talk with two other people in the room. How much longer do you suppose I can stand this?" "You've had only one day yet. It's too soon to complain. You may have 7 years," retorted Sylvia saucily, but at the bottom of her heart she was glad that he found it difficult to be patient. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George D. Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. By the river. Pixie went off in great spirits to join the Wallaces at the riverside cottage which they had rented for the remainder of the summer. The heat in town was already growing oppressive, and it was delightful to think of being in the country again and running free over the dear green fields. Esmeralda had presented her with quite a trousseau of summer dresses, with a selection of hair ribbons to match, at least an inch wider than any which she had previously possessed, and she piled up her pompadour higher than ever and pulled out the bows to their farthest extent in her anxiety to do justice to the occasion and the importance of her own position as the instructor of youth. A pony cart was at the station to meet her, with Viva and Inda clinging together on the front seat, ready to pour breathless confidences into her ear the moment she appeared. They spoke with a curious mingling of tongues, but had apparently no difficulty in understanding her when she replied in rapid, colloquial French, so that it was evident that the hours of play had not been wasted, but had the effect of successful study. Mamselle Patty, we have boats in our house," cried Viva eagerly. "3 boats with cushions and a punt, and one with a funnel in the middle. And Cousin Jim takes us out with another gentleman, and we splash with our hands, and the lady was cross because of her sash, and she dried it in the sun. And there's tea in the garden, and a big steamer that makes waves, and Muzzer says if we are very good, you will play with us at being gypsies under the wheelbarrow. And we got in a box, and the water went up and up and up, and then it went down and down and down. And then we came home," contributed fat little Enda in her deep gurgling voice. And Pixie turned from one to the other and cried, "Vraiment! Sans doute! Bravo!" and beamed in delighted expectation. The house party were assembled on the lawn drinking tea when the pony carriage turned in at the gate, and Pixie looked round with sparkling eyes, quite dazzled by the beauty of the scene. The narrow road running at the back of the houses had been dull and uninteresting, but before many yards of the drive had been traversed, there came a view over the wide sunlit river, and beyond it green meadows stretching as far away as the eye could reach. The house was not a cottage after all, but quite a large, imposing-looking house, and the lawn sloping to the river bank was smooth and soft as velvet. Baskets of flowers hung from the veranda. Picturesque stumps of trees were hollowed out to receive pots of geraniums. A red and white awning shaded the tea table, and the wicker chairs were plentifully supplied with scarlet cushions. It was Pixie's first peep at the summer glories of the river, and she felt as if she had stepped into fairyland itself. The little girls seized her hands and dragged her in triumph across the lawn, and Mrs. Wallace looked round and said smilingly to her friends, "Here's my French governess, the latest addition to the household. What do you think of my choice?" "Governess, that girl! She looks the child herself. Edith, what nonsense are you talking?" "Sense, my dear, I assure you. The wisest thing I ever did, as you will see before many hours are past. We shall have some peace now that she has arrived. Bonjour, mademoiselle. How I am happy to see thee again. Thou art not fatigued, no? Seat thyself in this chair, and I will make known to thee my friends." She spoke in French, and evidently wished her governess to appear as French, on this occasion at least, and Pixie rose to the occasion, sweeping elaborate bows from side to side, unconsciously elevating her shoulders, and waving expressive hands. She discoursed volubly about her long and adventurous journey of 3/4 of an hour duration, and Mrs. Wallace's guests looked on with smiling faces, putting an occasional laborious question as she appeared to be reaching the end of her story. There were several ladies, all young and pretty and beautifully dressed, and 3 strange men, including Cousin Jim and his soldier friend from India. Cousin Jim had bright twinkling eyes and looked full of life and spirit, but his friend's brown face was lined and haggard, and his smile was half-hearted, as if his thoughts were not in the present. Pixie noticed, however, that it was to his side that little Enda crept for support, and that his disengaged hand softly stroked the child's head from time to time, as if he found comfort in her presence. Such good friends did they appear that after the meal was finished she refused to be separated from him, and implored his company in the gypsy tent in the paddock. Mrs. Wallace protested, but the young fellow declared that he enjoyed being victimized, and walked off with the schoolroom party with the utmost good humour. "But I can't speak French, Viva," he explained. "Not well enough to be able to converse with mademoiselle, at least. You must explain to her that I am only a stupid Englishman, and ask her to excuse me. You can translate that for me, I suppose?"
"She's not French either. She's only pretending. She's only English, the same as me,"
protested Viva sturdily, and Pixie nodded at him with complacent smiles. "But I've lived abroad, so I speak it to them for their good. You've been away too, haven't you? I hope you enjoyed yourself?" He smiled, but it was rather a sad little smile, despite its amusement. "I went for work, you know, not pleasure. We accomplished what there was to do, which was satisfactory, but I can't honestly say I enjoyed it." "I hate work," agreed Pixie sympathetically. "We all do. It's in the family. Never do today what you can put off till tomorrow, my brother used to tell me, for you never know what may happen, and you may get out of it altogether if you wait. But if we are obliged to do it, we pretend we like it, for it's so dull to be unhappy. And if it was horrid abroad, it makes it all the nicer to come back, doesn't it?" "Sometimes," he said shortly. They had reached the gypsy encampment by this time, and were peremptorily commanded to sit down on a bench, pending certain important preparations under the wheelbarrow. So he took possession of one corner, and Pixie took the other, and stared at him with unabashed scrutiny. He was unhappy, she decided, and that was enough to enlist her wholehearted sympathy. But besides being unhappy, he was very good to look upon, with his bronzed skin, well-cut features, and soldierly bearing. She admired him immensely, and the admiration was mutual, though of a different nature. She was a quaint-looking little soul, the young fellow decided. Plain-looking, he had thought on first sight, but there was something oddly attractive about the wide eyes and large, curving lips. You wanted to look at them once and yet again, and each time you looked, the attraction increased. What was it? Not beauty, not intellect, not wit, nothing, it appeared, but a crystalline sincerity and sweetness of heart, which exercised an irresistible claim on the affections. His face softened, and he bent towards her with a kindly questioning. "How do you come to be governessing these children? You are so young still. 16, 17, is it? You ought to be in the schoolroom yourself." "There was nothing else I could do, and I wanted to earn some money because we're poor. I'm small, but I've known a lot of trouble," replied Pixie, with a complacent air which was distinctly trying to her companion's composure. He stroked his moustache to hide the twitching lips, and said solemnly, "I'm sorry, very sorry to hear that. I hope, however, it is all in the past. You look remarkably cheerful now." "That's because I'm helping, and we are such a nice family at home. If you are with the people you like best, that makes you happy, doesn't it? Without thinking of anything else?" "Yes," he said shortly, and rose from his seat to walk across to where the children were scrambling on the grass. They leapt on him and hung on his arms, and he played with them for 5 or 10 minutes, then produced a packet of chocolate from a pocket, and, giving it to Pixie to distribute, made his escape to the house. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George D. Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Confidence. During the next few days, the captain, as Viva called him, was constantly deserting his companions to join himself to the schoolroom party in their walks and games. As Pixie had suspected, his heart was sore, and the innocent affection which the children lavished upon him made their society more congenial than that of his own companions, who were enjoying their stay in the country in merry, uproarious fashion. Viva and Inda were interesting and original children, while Mamzelle Paddy was a house party in herself, a delicious combination of shrewdness and innocence. He had little chance of private conversation with her, for the children were exacting in their demands, but their intimacy rapidly increased, as was only natural under the circumstances. It was impossible to remain on formal terms with one who was united with yourself to withstand an assault of wild savages, as portrayed by 2 little girls, with branches of bracken waving above their heads, and geranium petals stuck in ferocious patterns about their cheeks. Impossible not to feel an affection for the tallest member of the battalion, which marched regularly every morning to the corner of the paddock to be drilled by their commander. Scarlet sashes crossed sideways over holland dresses, and Panama hats fastened by immaculate black chin straps. In the afternoon, when the grown-up members of the household drove off in state to attend garden parties at neighbouring mansions, the captain found it infinitely more enjoyable to punt slowly down the stream, dreaming his own dreams, or listening with a smile while the older child amused her juniors by quaint and adventurous stories. She was always happy, this little Mamzelle Paddy. Another girl of her age might have felt lonely and diffident in this large, bustling household, but she was sunshine personified, content to work, content to play, content to go on an expedition, content to be left behind, having no desires of her own, it would appear, excepting only this one, to love and be loved by those around. "Some day, Mamzelle," the captain said, "I will take you and the children a little jaunt on our own account. We will take a boat and go up the river to a dear little spot which I know very well, and there we will have tea and pretend to be Robinson Crusoes on a desert island. It is an island, you know, and we will take a basket of provisions with us, and boil our own kettle, and spread the tablecloth under the trees. Robinson didn't have tablecloths, I believe, but we will improve on the story and go shopping in the village to see what we can buy." "Wants to go now?" Inda insisted, while Viva executed a war dance of triumph, and Pixie murmured deeply, "I love picnics. We had a beauty once when I was young. 'Twas some friends nearby, and they asked me and Miles, and ye could smell the cooking coming up the drive. All sorts of things cooked for days before, and packed in hampers. We went there by train, to the place we were going to, I mean, but by bad luck the hampers went somewhere else, through leaving them on the platform without seeing them put in. You get very hungry when you are enjoying yourself, and there was nothing to be bought in the village but bread and spring onions and herrings in barrels. 'Twas a lucky accident all the same, for we had the picnic and a party next day to eat up the food." "Well, we'll look after the hamper this time. We should not find even the onions on our island," said the captain, laughing. "We will ask Mrs. Wallace's permission when she comes home, and begin preparations tomorrow morning, if it is fine." Mrs. Wallace protested that the children were being spoiled by so much kindness, but was delighted to give her consent, and the next morning was happily employed in packing the tea basket and purchasing strawberries, cakes, and chocolates from the shops in the village. Several of the visitors pleaded to be allowed to join the party, and tried to wheedle invitations from the children during the luncheon hour, to their own humiliation and defeat. "You would like to have me with you, wouldn't you, darling? You would like to sit next to me in the boat?" pleaded one pretty young lady of the chubby baby, but Inda wriggled away and replied sturdily, "Don't want you in the boat. Don't want nobody, only the captain and Mamzelle. You go another picnic by yourself." "You must forgive us, Miss Rose, but this is strictly a limited expedition. We children want to be as mischievous as we like, without the controlling influence of grown-up people. No best frocks, please, Mrs. Wallace. Just holland pinafores that we can soil as much as we like," pleaded the captain, feeling more than rewarded for his firmness as he met the adoring glances of 3 pairs of innocent eyes. There was quite a little assembly by the boathouse to speed the expedition on its way, and it is safe to say that no boat on the river that afternoon carried a happier, more excited party. The captain rowed, Pixie sat in the stern and pulled the rudder lines according to instructions, with occasional lapses of memory when she mistook her right hand for her left, and was surprised to find the boat going in an opposite direction from what had been intended. The little girls sat on either side, as yet too mindful of their promises of good behaviour even to splash the water. They snored with excitement at the mystery of the first lock, and wrapped their hands in their pinafores to keep them safely out of the way, since the captain said that it was impossible to be too careful in such places. Along the banks were dotted beautiful houses set back in luxuriant gardens. Round the bend of the river stood a houseboat, known by the fascinating name of the Yellow Butterfly. The paint was white, but everything else was a rich, glowing yellow. Yellow plants and flowers in baskets, yellow curtains to the windows, yellow cushions on the chairs. Actually, if you can believe it, a yellow parakeet in a golden cage on the top deck.
"I should like to live and die in that houseboat!" cried Viva rapturously.
Presently came the sound of music from afar, and a thud, 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 which foretold the advent of a steamer. Now there would be waves, real true up and down waves, and you could pretend you were going to be drowned and the boat go upside down. What fun! What fun! The gurgles of excitement, the clutchings of Mamselle's skirts, the shrieks of exultation as the happy moment grew near, were as charming to the beholder as to the children themselves. In the sunny reaches of the river the boats carried Japanese umbrellas which made charming touches of colour against the green. Under the great trees more boats were moored in the shade, while their occupants brought out the tea baskets from beneath the seats. Viva and Inda regarded all such proceedings as deliberate offences against their exclusive rights, and angrily pointed out the fact that other people were having picnics too, but the captain soothed them by a promise that the island should be their private property, and that he would fight to the death to keep off foreign invasions. Already this land of promise was looming in the distance, and presently they were rowing slowly round and round, looking for a convenient place of landing, tying the rope to the trunk of a willow whose branches dipped in the stream, and stepping cautiously ashore. The children were wild with excitement, but the captain claimed for himself a quarter of an hour's rest and smoke before proceeding to the difficult business of boiling the kettle, and the two little girls scampered off to explore the island, promising faithfully to keep clear of the banks. "Mamselle shall stay and talk to me. It's my turn to be amused," he said, but for once Pixie did not seem in a talkative mood, but leant silently against the stump of a tree, staring around her with dreamy eyes. The young fellow watched her curiously as he pulled his pipe out of his pocket and prepared for the longed-for smoke. "What are you thinking of, Mamselle?" he asked, and Pixie looked round with a little start of remembrance. "I don't know. Everything. Nothing in particular, only that it's so warm and sunny and pretty, and you are so kind. I wasn't thinking anything really, only being happy." "Only being happy, were you?" he repeated softly. "Does it seem so easy, little Mamselle? Some of the richest men in the world would give all their money if you could teach them that little secret. Only being happy is a very difficult thing to some of us as we grow older in this world." Pixie looked at him with an anxious scrutiny. "But you were happy once, weren't you?" she asked. "Before you were miserable? People have been kind to you too, and made you happy before you began to be worried?" "I worried? I miserable? Mamselle, what can you mean? I am out for a picnic with 3 charming ladies for my guests. How can I be anything but proud and delighted?" He spoke with affected hilarity, but Pixie was not so easily convinced, and shook her head incredulously as she replied, "No, you are not happy, really, not through and through. You sigh in the middle of laughing, and think of something else when you pretend to listen. I've been in trouble myself. Once there was an awful time when the girls sent me to Coventry for weeks on end, and there was a horrid dull pain inside me, as if I'd swallowed up a lump of lead. Was someone unkind to you too?" He laughed, a short, mirthless laugh, and pushed his hair from his brow. It was a strange thing that he should dream of confiding his story to this bit of a girl, yet never before had he known such an impulse to speak. "No, mam'selle," he said, "not unkind. It was not in her nature to be that. The mistake was all on my side. I was a conceited coxcomb to think she could ever care for me, but I did think it, and went on dreaming my foolish castle in the air, until one day it fell to the ground, and left me sitting among the ruins." "It was a heart affair, then? I thought it was," cried Pixie shrewdly. "I heard a lot about heart affairs in Paris, and I had a sister once who was married. Her husband used to look just like you do when she was cross to him, but really and truly she wanted to be kind, and now they are married and living happily ever after. It will come all right for you too, some day." "No, never. There's no hope of that. She married someone else. That was the news which came to me one day and wrecked my castle." "Oh! Oh, how could she? The misguided creature! And when she might have had you instead." "I'd marry you myself if I were big enough!" cried Pixie in a fervour of indignation which was more soothing than any expressions of sympathy, and the Captain stretched out his hand and patted her tenderly on the shoulder. "Would you really? That's very sweet of you. Thank you, dear, for the compliment. We will be real good friends in any case, won't we? And you will keep my confidence, for no one in this place knows anything about it, and we won't talk of it any more, I think. It's rather a sore subject, don't you know? We might begin unpacking those baskets. The children will want their tea." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the Lock. The tea making was attended with the usual excitements, and the kettle boiling with the inevitable misadventures. A scouting party was organised to discover a sheltered spot in which to lay the fire, but although until this minute the day had appeared absolutely calm and tranquil, all the winds of heaven seemed to unite in blowing upon that unfortunate fire from the moment that the match was applied. When at long last a feeble flame was established, the sticks promptly collapsed and precipitated the kettle to the ground. When rebuilt more solidly, it died out for want of a draught, and when at last, and at very long last, the smoke was seen issuing from the kettle spout, lo, the water was smoked and unfit to drink. So decided the Captain, at least, but while he drank milk with the little girls, Pixie emptied the teapot with undiminished enjoyment. "It gives it a flavour," she said. "I like to taste what I'm drinking." It was not a trifle like smoked tea which would mar Mamzelle Paddy's enjoyment when on pleasure bent. The Captain's preparations had been on so lavish a scale that there was quite a supply of good things left when the meal was finished, and by a kindly thought these were packed together to give to the children of the lock keeper on the way upstream. When every odd piece of paper had been religiously collected and packed in the hamper with the cups and saucers, the little girls were lifted into the boat, Pixie pulled the rudder ropes over her shoulders, and the captain pushed the boat from the shore and jumped lightly into his seat. They were off again, rowing homewards and passing once more all the fascinating landmarks which they had noticed on the way down. The picnickers on the banks were fastening hampers and preparing to depart. On the green lawns by the waterside, servants were flitting to and fro carrying trays into the house. Inda was beginning to yawn and long for bed. She leant against Pixie, the weight of the small head becoming ever heavier and heavier, but roused up again as the boat entered the box, as she persisted in calling a lock. She wanted to hand out the parcel of good things without a moment's delay, but the captain told her to wait until the water had lifted the boat nearer to the bank. It seemed an extraordinary thing that, whereas in passing through the lock before they had gone down, 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 they should now rise higher with every moment that passed. The children had 100 questions to ask, while the captain stood up and kept the boat in position with a boat hook. He explained the mystery as simply as possible, and also why he was at such pains to keep at a safe distance from the walls. "You see those things sticking out from the side of the boat into which I put my oars? They're called rowlocks, and when you are coming upstream through a lock, you have to be careful indeed not to let them catch under any of the beams. It would be almost impossible to get them loose again, you see, because every moment more water would pour in and press them tighter and tighter."
"And what would it do to us if it did press them?"
Viva inquired curiously, whereat the captain smiled and shook his head. "Something very disagreeable, I'm afraid. Give us all a good wetting in the water. You needn't be afraid of that, though, when you're with me, for I shall take good care of my little crew. You see how far away I keep with this oar."
"Yes, I see. But why does one end of the boat stick out into the middle and the other into the side?"
"It's the current that sweeps it round, the force of the water that is coming under the gates. That doesn't matter so long as we are not caught." "But the end is caught, isn't it? That little bit of iron that sticks up at the pointed end!" cried Pixie suddenly. She was densely ignorant of all that concerns boats, and invariably alluded to the bow and the stern as the blunt and pointed ends, to the captain's intense amusement. This time, however, he did not smile. Pixie saw his face set suddenly as he turned his head to look in the direction of her outstretched finger, but his voice sounded reassuringly confident. "Oh, I see, yes. Let me pass you, dear, for a moment. Sit quite still." He stepped past her into the space occupied by the hampers, and stamped vigorously, first with one foot, then with two, jumped with all his weight, then stepped quickly back to the centre of the boat, and called to the man at the sluices. "Hi there! Stop! My boat is caught! Turn off that water quick! Man, do you hear me?" But the man's head was turned in the opposite direction, and he was so much engrossed with his work that it was some moments before he heard, and meantime it was terrifying to see how swiftly the water arose, how dangerously near to its edge grew the side of the boat. The children began to shriek and stand on their seats, and the captain seized Inda in his arms and held her up, calling loudly for help. The lock keeper was hurriedly dropping the sluices, but at the sound of the continued cries his wife ran out of the house and across the bridgeway. In another moment she would be able to lift Inda ashore, but Viva, frantic with terror, was clamouring to be taken too, and Pixie impetuously lifted her towards the bank. What happened next is difficult to describe, so swiftly did it happen. So like a nightmare did it appear for ever after in the memories of those concerned. The woman came rushing forward, followed by her husband. They seized the children and dragged them on the bank. The boat, relieved suddenly of a weight, gave an unexpected lurch, and the next moment Pixie and the captain were in the water. The children screamed aloud in terror, but the captain had hardly disappeared before he was up again, capless, and shaking the water from his head, but looking none the worse for his ducking. But it was a long, agonizing minute before there came a swirling and bubbling at the end of the lock, and Pixie's white, unconscious little face floated on the surface. The captain's arm was round her in an instant. The lock keeper threw a rope to help him to the iron ladder fixed in the walls of the lock, and between them the two men carried the dripping figure along the bank and into the house. There was a sofa in an inner room, and there they laid her, while the woman, assisted by her eldest daughter, took off the wringing garments and wrapped her round with warm blankets and coverings. The captain ran out into the village, sent a messenger flying for a doctor, and rushed back again in terror lest the two little girls should have taken advantage of his absence to get into fresh mischief. This was a pretty ending to their expedition. What would Mrs. Wallace say to him when he got home? And what should he say to himself if through any fault or carelessness a serious injury had happened to sweet little Mamselle? Why on earth do they want to put these irons at the end of a boat? Wretches, dangerous things, cried the distracted man to himself. To think that I have been through 1,000 locks in safety, and that this should have happened just when I had made myself responsible for a party of children. Never again. Never again if I get safely out of this. I wonder how long that doctor fellow will take to come along. Viva and Inda were sitting in the front kitchen, glancing askance at several rosy, curly-headed children who were shyly huddled together by the door. The fascination of new surroundings and possible new playmates had diverted their minds from their misfortunes, and the captain heaved a sigh of relief as he passed into the inner room. The lock keeper's wife had filled 2 bottles with hot water and put one to Pixie's feet and another between her cold hands. A towel was wrapped round the wet locks with somewhat ghastly effect, and the young man shivered as he looked down at the still white face. "She's not. She can't be," he faltered, not having the courage to pronounce the dread word, and to his inexpressible relief the woman smiled at the thought.
Not she. Stunned a bit, that's all. Perhaps hit her head in falling. I've often had them like this before, and they are pretty well all right in a few hours. We have a lot of people up here in summer time who know nothing about managing a boat. No offence to you, sir. I dare say you are well accustomed to them, but accidents will happen."
"I thought I was," sighed the captain dismally. He knelt down by the couch, touched the cold cheek with his fingers. "Feels a little warmer, doesn't she? For goodness sake, take that thing off her head. I can't bear to see it." The woman lifted the head from the pillow to unloosen the tight folds, and at the movement Pixie sighed and opened wide, bewildered eyes. For the first moment they held nothing but blankest surprise at finding herself in so extraordinary a position, but even as the captain held his breath in suspense, a spark of remembrance came into the clear depths, and the face lit up with a flickering merriment.
"Were we drowned?" she whispered hoarsely. "The 2 of us? Viva jumped and the boat slipped and my feet went down. Who saved me? Was it you?"
"I suppose it was, but it was not a very heroic rescue. Only a few yards to the bank. You are sure you feel all right? Quite warm and comfortable? Your head doesn't ache?" Pixie shook her dishevelled head from side to side, frowning the while in speculative fashion. "I think it does, a little bit, but I'm not quite sure. It feels muzzy," she declared, with a gesture and accent which lent some enlightenment to the enigmatical expression. Then she stretched out a hand and touched him anxiously on the shoulder. "You're drenched. You'll catch all sorts of diseases in those wet clothes. Can't you have some blankets too? I'm so lovely and warm."
My husband is putting out some clothes for you upstairs, sir. You had better go and change. The young lady is all right now, and I will tell you when the doctor comes."
"Doctor? Is a doctor coming to see me?" Pixie asked, rapturously incredulous. To find herself the heroine of an adventure, a genuine thrilling adventure, to lie stretched upon a sofa wrapped in blankets, with 2 attendants anxiously inquiring her symptoms, to know that a doctor was hurrying to her side. This was indeed a glorious ending to the day's enjoyment. She lay back on the cushions, wreathed in smiles, and the doctor, coming in hurriedly, was somewhat taken aback to behold so radiant a patient. "I fainted!" cried Pixie proudly. "I never fainted before in all my life. I don't remember a single thing after I slipped until I woke up on this sofa." "Indeed, and a very sensible arrangement. Just as well to know nothing about these disagreeable experiences." The doctor smiled and fingered her head with a careful touch. "Does that hurt you? No? Does that? Do you feel any tenderness there? A little bit, eh? You don't like me to press it? You probably grazed yourself slightly as you fell, and that caused the faint. Nothing serious, though. You need not be frightened." "I like it," said Pixie stoutly, and the burst of laughter with which the 2 hearers greeted this statement sounded pleasantly in the captain's ears, as he dressed himself in the lock-keeper's Sunday garments in the room overhead. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lovers' meetings. The doctor saw no reason why Pixie should not be driven home, and offered to order a closed carriage in the village, and pending its arrival, the adventurers enjoyed another cup of tea, not smoked this time, and made merry over the change in their appearance, wrought by the borrowed clothing. Pixie's red merino dress was the pride of little Miss Lock-keeper's heart, but about 2 sizes too big for its present occupant. The bodice hung in folds about her tiny figure, the sleeves came down to her fingertips, the captain's shiny black suit made him appear quite clumsy and awkward, but that was all part of the fun in the estimation of 3 members of the party at least. Mrs. Wallace was undecided whether to laugh or to cry as she welcomed her truants and listened to the story of their adventures. Nothing would satisfy her but to dispatch Pixie to bed forthwith, to that young lady's intense mortification, and to order the captain upstairs to have a hot bath and a dose of quinine. When he came downstairs she was putting a letter in the post box in the hall, and, motioning towards it, explained its purport. "I've been writing to Mamzelle's sister in London. These lock accidents get into the papers sometimes, and are generally exaggerated into something really so thrilling and terrible it's best to tell the true story ourselves. And I have brought this trouble upon you. I could kick myself for my stupidity. You will never trust me again, but please make me the scapegoat to the sister, and let her wreak her wrath on me. It's not fair that you should be blamed." "Oh, I am not afraid of any wrath, I assure you. She's a charming girl, and as sweet as Mamzelle herself. I have asked her to come down to-morrow and see for herself that there is no harm done. I thought that was the best way out of the difficulty, and please don't blame yourself too much. It was an accident, and we must just be very, very thankful that you were all preserved from harm." The next morning the captain took himself off for a long walk, ostensibly to call on some friends, in reality to avoid meeting the visitor from town. For, though a man may boldly acknowledge his responsibility and offer to bear the blame, He has an instinctive shrinking from the society of females in distress, and will walk a very long distance in order to avoid anything like a scene. It seemed the height of bad fortune that this particular visitor should arrive in the afternoon instead of in the morning, and that he should stumble into the library almost immediately after she had arrived. She was seated on an ottoman with her back towards him, but Mrs. Wallace's quick exclamation took away any chance of retreating unseen.
"Why, here he is!"
she cried.
"This is the culprit, or the hero, whichever you choose to call him. Come and tell your own story, Dick. This is Mademoiselle's sister, Miss O'Shaughnessy."
But he had recognised her already. She had turned her head as Mrs. Wallace spoke, and beneath the curving brim of the hat he had seen the face which had been enshrined in his heart for 3 long years, the sweet face which had brought to him at once the greatest joy and the bitterest sorrow of his life. He stood still in the middle of the room, staring at her as if suddenly turned to stone, and Bridgie rose to her feet, the pretty colour fading out of her cheeks, her lips a-tremble with emotion. Mrs. Wallace looked from one to the other, and with a woman's intuition divined something very nearly approaching the truth. Dick was quite changed from his old happy self. Everyone had noticed it, and speculated as to the cause. In his last furlough he had stayed some time in Ireland. Could it be? Could it possibly be?
"You have met before,"
she said quickly.
"That is very nice. You know each other, and can talk over yesterday's adventure without my help. Will you excuse me if I leave you for a few moments while I give some orders to the maids?"
No one answered, but she lost no time in hurrying from the room, and as the door closed behind her, the captain came slowly across the room, staring at Bridgie's white face. "Miss O'Shaughnessy. She called you Miss O'Shaughnessy." She shrank before him, scared by his strange, excited manner. "Yes, it is my name. I am Bridgie O'Shaughnessy. Don't you remember me?" "Remember you?" he repeated with an emphasis which was more eloquent than 100 protestations. He seized her hands in a painful pressure. "You were not married then? It was not true? You did not marry him, as they told me?" You thought I was married? Oh, what put such an idea into your head?" "I heard it 18 months ago, shortly after your last letter arrived, telling me about your father, and hinting at other changes which might follow. My friend wrote that Miss O'Shaughnessy was engaged to a fellow with a lot of money, Hilliard, that they were going to be married almost at once. Was it all an invention? Was there no truth in it at all?" "It was quite true, quite. But it was Esmeralda, not me. She married him over a year ago." "Esmeralda? Your sister? But he said the eldest daughter, and you are the eldest. I knew I was not mistaken about that, for I remember every word you had told me." Bridgie smiled faintly. The colour was coming back into her cheeks, and the grey eyes met his with shy, incredulous happiness. "But most people give her the credit for it all the same. There's so much more of her, you see. You never wrote to ask if it were true." "I was too proud and hurt, badly hurt, Bridgie, mortally badly. And you never wrote to ask why I was silent. Were you proud too? Or contemptuous? Which was it? Did you think I was nothing but a flirt, and a heartless one at that?" "I never thought unkindly of you, but I suppose I was proud, for I couldn't write when all the money was gone. And I was so poor. I thought you had forgotten, or met someone else. I hoped you were very happy, only I wasn't," faltered Bridgie, with a little break in her voice as she spoke that last word, which brought the tears to the captain's eyes. He bent his head over the clasped hands and kissed them 12 times over. "Bridgie, Bridgie!" he cried brokenly. "Is it true? Have I found you again after all these years? Can you forgive me for this wretched blunder which has brought such unhappiness upon us both? I am thankful to know you were unhappy too, for I had nothing to go on, Bridgie, no claim whatever upon you, only you must have guessed how I felt. I could not believe that you had really given yourself to me in that short time." "I couldn't myself," said Bridgie naively. "I tried to pretend that it was all a mistake, that I was quite happy without you." She looked up at him shyly and shook her head in the most beguiling denial. "'Twas not a mite of use. I remember all the same. And are you sure, quite sure, that you thought of me all the time? Was there never anyone else all these long, long years?" The captain smiled and stroked his moustache in amused, contemplative fashion. "There was never anyone, except one girl. I met one girl who quite stole my heart, and I think I stole hers into the bargain." "Oh, oh, how dreadful! Why did you tell me? But you never thought of marrying her, did you, Dick?" "I'm not so sure. She did." He laughed and seized her hands once more. "No, it's too bad. I won't tease you. It was Mamzelle Paddy, darling, to whom I confided my story, and who comforted me in her own sweet fashion. And she is your sister, and it is she who has brought us together. Bridgie, if I didn't love you with all my heart, I believe I should still have to marry you, for nothing else than to be Mamzelle's brother." But Bridgie did not affect to be jealous. She threw back her head and smiled happily as she answered, "I'm thankful to hear you say it, for whoever marries me must love Pixie too. I can never leave her behind me." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of More About Pixie by Mrs. George de Horne VAIZEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusion. The news of Captain Victor's engagement and long attachment to the charming Miss O'Shaughnessy caused the greatest interest and excitement among the guests at the cottage, while his old friends rejoiced to see the happy brightness on his face. "Welcome home, Dick!" Mr. Wallace cried, shaking him warmly by the hand. "Thankful to see you back again, instead of that other fellow who has been moping about in your clothes." And Pixie commented on the announcement with her usual outspoken honesty. "I told ye it would come all right. I suppose it was you Bridgie was fretting about when I thought it was the bills. She's got dips in her cheeks, only you can't see them now because she's blushing. I'm glad you are coming into the family, but I don't see how you can ever be married. She can't be spared." The captain laughed at that statement, and vowed that she would have to be spared, and that at an early date. But a shadow fell across Bridgie's face, and as they sat alone in the garden, she said anxiously, "I'm afraid I have been selfish, Dick. I can think of nothing but you, but after all, Pixie was quite right. I can't possibly be spared for a long time to come. She won't be old enough to take charge of a house for 3 years at the soonest, and Jack has been so good and unselfish that I couldn't possibly leave him in the lurch. You have waited so long that you won't mind waiting a few years longer, will you?" "It doesn't seem to me a particularly logical conclusion, sweetheart," said the captain, smiling. "Personally, I feel that I ought to be rewarded at once, but I won't make any promises one way or the other until I have met your brother and heard his views. Don't worry yourself. You shan't do anything that you feel to be wrong, but I don't despair of finding a solution of the difficulty when it is an alternative between that and waiting for you for 3 years, Bridgie. I shall be very, very resourceful. I don't know what you can do. It's no use suggesting a housekeeper. The boys would not hear of it, and she'd be destroyed in a week with the life they would lead her. So argued Bridgie, but she was willing to be convinced, and too happy in the present to feel much concern for the future. The weight of depression which had laid on her heart, despite her brave cheeriness of manner, was lifted once and forever, now that she was convinced of Dick's faithful love, and it seemed impossible that she could ever be more content than at this moment. Until now, almost all the joys of her life had come from an unselfish pleasure in the good fortune of others, but this wonderful new happiness was her very own, hers and Dick's, and she could hardly believe that it was true and not a wonderful dream. Mrs. Wallace's letter had conveyed an invitation to stay for the night, so the lovers had 2 days to sit and talk together in the lovely summer garden before returning to give an account of themselves in Rutland Road. Jack was not prepared to see a stranger accompanying his sister, but he welcomed him with Irish heartiness and guessed how the land lay at the first glance at Bridgie's face. So did Pat. So did Miles, but they concealed their suspicions with admirable tact, and talked persistently through the evening meal with intent to relieve the embarrassment which was so evidently experienced by the hostess. Poor Bridgie was painfully conscious of the enormity of her conduct as she looked from one to the other of her 3 big brothers. Jack's manner was nervous and excited, poor fellow! He was evidently dreading the explanations which were in store. Pat was looking pale. He grew so fast that he needed constant care. Miles kept handing her the mustard with sympathetic effusion. He had a heart of gold and could be led with a word, but it must be the right word, and woe to the housekeeper of the future if she tried to rule by force. She smiled at him with wistful apology, and Miles patted her hand affectionately under the tablecloth. It was a pity when a sensible girl like Bridgie made an idiot of herself by falling in love, but they all seemed to do it sooner or later, and there was no use making a fuss, Master Miles told himself resignedly. She seemed to have met this Captain Victor years ago, and to have corresponded with him in India, but she had never mentioned his name at home. How strange to know that Bridgie had had an interest beyond her own brothers and sisters! Miles felt mildly aggrieved, but consoled himself by the reflection that the captain seemed a decent sort of fellow with plenty to say for himself. He had been on active service twice already, and though he refused details of manslaughter, gave such a graphic account of tiger shooting expeditions as made Miles's lips water, and aroused rebellious repinings at his own hard lot in living in a miserable suburb, where the only sport to be obtained was the tracking of a few superfluous cats. When dinner was over, the 2 boys discreetly lingered behind while their elders retired to the drawing-room, and Bridgie grew rosy red with embarrassment as the door closed behind them. "We wanted to tell you, Jack," she began nervously. "I would have told you before, only there was nothing to tell. There isn't now. At least, I mean, it won't be for a long, long time, dear. Not until you don't want me any more." "Better let me try, Bridgie," cried the captain, laughing. He put his hand on her shoulder in a proudly possessive fashion and looked Jack full in the face. "She is dreadfully afraid of what you will say, and ashamed of herself for daring to think of anything but her home duties. It doesn't seem to strike her that she has a duty to me too, when I've been thinking of her for the last 3 years. I must explain to you, O'Shaughnessy, that a friend wrote to tell me that your eldest sister was about to be married to a man called Hilliard. and by an unfortunate coincidence, Bridgie herself had vaguely referred to coming changes in her last letter, so I believed the report, and we have mutually been eating our hearts and believing the other to be faithless. There was no engagement, you must understand, but I made up my mind about her the first day we met, and she now acknowledges that she ran away because she was afraid I might interfere with her home claims. You see, I have already spared her to you for 3 good years, so I think it is my turn now. My friends will tell you that I have been miserably dull and surly, and for their sakes alone I feel I ought to make a stand. And Bridgie has always been sweet and cheerful. We have each expected her to be sorry for us in turns, and never once suspected that she needed us to be sorry for her too. Thank you, Bridgie, said Jack, looking across at her with a loving look which was the sweetest reward which she could possibly have received for the struggles which had been so gallantly concealed. It was my greatest comfort to have you all to work and care for, when I thought he had forgotten, she cried hastily. And I have loved helping you, Jack. Please speak honestly, dear. Let us all speak out honestly. Of course I want to be with Dick, but I want most of all to do what is right. We all do. And the children must come first. You can't be left alone, Jack, and there is no one else to take my place. Unless, began Jack slowly. Bridgie looked at him in surprise and saw the red flush come creeping up from beneath his collar, touch his cheeks, and mount up and up to the roots of his curling hair. Unless I married myself, he said breathlessly, and at that Bridgie darted forward and caught him by both hands. What? What? What, Jack, what do you mean? Is it Sylvia? Of course it is Sylvia. And does she... Jack, what does it mean? Are you engaged too? Have you been keeping it from me because you thought we wouldn't let you think you were in our way? We loved you too much, old girl, and so we were quietly waiting until I came along, concluded Dick Victor tersely. The 3 young people stood staring at each other for a moment, and the tears brimmed over in Bridgie's eyes, but presently she began to laugh, and the young men joined in with a sense of the happiest relief. Each one had been thinking of the other, and putting personal hopes in the background. And lo, in the simplest, most delightful of fashions, the knot was cut, and each was left free to be happy after his heart's desire. "Oh, it's perfectly perfect!" cried Bridgie rapturously. "The boys adore Sylvia, and will be her devoted slaves. She is twice the housekeeper that I am, and she's been so lonely, poor darling, without her parents. Oh, Jack, how nice of you to care for her and give her a home!" "That's what she says," replied Jack naively. "Shall we send for her to join the council? She ought to have her say. I'll run across—" No, send Mary. I want to see her first. I want to see exactly how she looks when she knows she is found out," Bridgie insisted. So Mary was promptly dispatched on her errand, and back came Sylvia, wondering and excited, and not a little mystified by the presence of the tall stranger. "Master Jack has good taste," said the captain to himself, as he looked at the dainty figure and erect little head with its crop of curls. "Rather an embarrassing position for the poor girl. Hope they break it to her gently." But it was not the O'Shaughnessy custom to break news gently or in a circuitous fashion, and the moment Sylvia entered the doorway, Bridgie flew at her with outstretched arms, crying incoherently and with sublime disregard of grammar, "Oh, Sylvia, I'm engaged! That's him! It's been a mistake all the time, and we are going to be married at once. We are all going to be married, Dick and me and you and Jack, and you are coming here to look after the house. I thought I couldn't be married because of Jack, and he thought he couldn't be married because of me. And now it's all right, and we can all be happy. I congratulate you, Sylvia. Congratulate me. I made Jack let me tell you, for I knew you would be so surprised. Don't you feel too bewildered to take it in?" "I do," replied Sylvia, with much truth. Red as a rose was she at this sudden and public announcement of her engagement, not knowing where to look or what to say, yet with a consciousness of immense happiness to come, and unfeigned delight at the happy ending to Bridgie's love story. Dick Victor came forward and introduced himself, and presently they all seated themselves and tried to discuss the future in staid, responsible fashion. The captain expected to be quartered in England for the immediate future, but could not, of course, be certain of his ultimate movements. He proposed that he and Bridgie should look out for a furnished house, so as to have a home of their own, and yet be ready for such changes as might arise. Jack anxiously questioned Sylvia as to the responsibility which would be hers, and she professed herself only too ready to sister the two dear boys. "And Pixie! I should love to have Pixie!" she cried, whereat Bridgie frowned and fidgeted restlessly on the sofa. "We will make definite arrangements later on," she said. "Everything cannot be decided at once. The boys will be quite enough trouble for you, me dear. They are as good as gold, but they will grow, and their clothes wear out so fast. And since we came to town, they've taken a distaste to patches, and they want money in their own pockets, the same as the other boys they meet. If I give you some shillings just to jingle and show they are there, will that satisfy you? I asked Pat only last week, and he laughed in my face. It's hard to say no when they smile at you, Sylvia, but you'll have to do it." "I don't know," said Sylvia slowly. The others looked at her questioningly, and she turned to Jack with a sparkling face. "I was waiting for a chance of telling you. Mr. Nisbet telegraphed to Ceylon about father's death, and I've had a letter from his lawyers. It came last night, and I'm rich, Jack. Isn't it lovely? Really quite rich. The lawsuit was settled in his favour, and he was coming home to settle, and now everything comes to me. I can help with the boys, and some day when you are ready we can go back to Knock and live in the old home again. I've been so happy since I heard, thinking that at last I could do something for you too. You are pleased about it, aren't you, Jack? Do say you are pleased." Jack's beaming smile was the best answer to that question. "'Deed, I'm delighted," he declared. "I'll spend money with any man alive, and the more there is, the better I'm pleased. We will stay where we are and see the boys settled and let Geoffrey enjoy his lease, and then we'll go home, and I shall probably have some savings of my own to add to yours by that time, and not feel I'm living on my wife. I'm thankful you have the money, and I'm thankful that I knew nothing of it before we were engaged." "And so am I," said Sylvia softly. A week later there was a second conference, at which every member of the family put in an appearance, and the question of the hour was, "Who shall have Pixie? Where shall Pixie have her home?" "I am the head of the family. It is the right thing that she should be with me. Sylvia and I would both like to have her, so it is unnecessary to discuss the point any further," said Mr. Jack with an air. "I don't wish to say anything in the least unkind to Sylvia. You know that, don't you, dear?" cried Esmeralda the magnificent, sitting amidst billows of chiffon and lace, and smiling sweetly across the room. "But the fact remains that I am Pixie's real sister, and she is not, and I think a sister's claim comes before a brother's. Bridgie will have no settled home, and I am at Knock. Anyone might see at a glance that her home ought to be with me under the circumstances." "I want Pixie," said Bridgie softly. "I want Pixie." and Pixie sat on the edge of the sofa and looked from one to the other with bright bird-like glances. Everyone wanted her. Everyone had an argument to prove a prior claim. They were all arguing and struggling for the supreme happiness of welcoming her into their households. It was the happiest moment of her life. "It's like Solomon and the babies," she cried exultantly. "You'll have to cut me in threes and divide the pieces. Esmeralda shall have my head for the times when she loses her own. Sylvia shall have my feet because she limps herself, and—" she looked across the room deep into Bridgie's eyes. "Bridgie shall have my heart. It would be with her anyway, wherever she went." The tears brimmed over in Bridgie's eyes. Esmeralda frowned quickly, then glanced at Geoffrey as he stood by her side, and softened into a smile. Jack stifled a sigh and said gravely, "Pixie has settled the question for herself. After that confession there can be no more to say. Take her, Bridgie, but be generous and spare her to us for part of the year. We all need you, Pixie. Wise little head, willing little feet, loving little heart, every single bit of you. Come and help us as often as you can." End of More About Pixie by Mrs. George D. Horne VAIZEY.